My name is Gloria, and I'm 57 years old. For 31 years, I thought I knew every detail about my husband, Richard. Then at his funeral, my entire world collapsed when I discovered he'd been living a double life. The humiliation was unbearable, as strangers mocked me, calling me the other woman. But Richard's will contained a twist no one expected, and the letter he left only for me would change everything. If you're watching this from somewhere that's dealt with heartbreak too, let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you want to hear how I discovered my husband's secret life and the surprising way he made things right in the end. I met Richard Hamilton when I was 22 years old. I was working as a waitress at a small diner just 2 blocks from the accounting firm where he'd recently been hired. He was 26, ambitious with kind brown eyes and a smile that made me forget whatever order I was supposed to be taking. He came in every single day for 3 months, always sitting at the same booth, always ordering the same black coffee and blueberry muffin. We'd make small talk, nothing serious, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made my heart flutter every time the bell above the door announced his arrival. It was April 17th when he finally asked me out. I remember because it was pouring rain and he'd forgotten his umbrella. He stood there dripping on the linoleum floor, his usually perfect hair plastered to his forehead, and instead of his usual coffee order, he blurted out, "Would you like to have dinner with me this weekend?" I said yes before he could even finish the question. Our first date was at a little Italian restaurant downtown. He wore a blue button-down shirt that matched his eyes, and I spent 2 hours getting ready in my tiny apartment. He was a perfect gentleman, pulling out my chair, asking thoughtful questions about my dreams and ambitions. By the end of the night, I knew this was different from any other relationship I'd had. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. It wasn't some grand gesture, just the two of us having a picnic in Grant Park. He pulled out a small velvet box containing his grandmother's diamond ring. "I can't promise you wealth or perfection," he said, "but I can promise you that I'll love you completely for the rest of my life." At least, that's what I thought he promised. Our wedding was small but elegant. Just 50 guests at a historic chapel with a reception at a local garden. I wore a simple white dress, and Richard cried when I walked down the aisle. My parents were beaming in the front row. His parents had passed when he was in college, so his side was mostly colleagues and college friends. We danced to Frank Sinatra and fed each other cake and promised forever. After we married, I finished my education degree and became a kindergarten teacher at Lakeside Elementary. I loved working with the children, their innocent enthusiasm and boundless energy filling my days with purpose. Richard continued climbing the ladder at his accounting firm, eventually making partner when we were in our 30s. His specialty was handling accounts for clients with multiple businesses and complex financial situations. The irony of that expertise wouldn't dawn on me until decades later. The only shadow on our happiness was our inability to have children. We tried for years. Fertility treatments, multiple rounds of IVF, special diets, even acupuncture. Each failure was devastating. Each negative pregnancy test, another small crack in my heart. After our 4th failed IVF attempt, we sat down and had a tearful conversation. We decided that maybe our path was different, that we could have a fulfilling life, just the two of us. Richard held me all night as I mourned the children we never have, assuring me that I was enough for him, that we were enough together. We settled into a comfortable routine in our suburban Chicago home. Richard's career required frequent travel, usually 3 or 4 days every couple of weeks. He'd fly to Portland, Seattle, sometimes New York, handling major accounts that required personal attention. I missed him during those trips, but was proud of his success and the comfortable life it provided us. When he was home, he was completely present, helping with housework, planning special date nights, bringing me wildflowers just because. We had our rituals: Sunday brunches on our patio in summer, holiday parties for his firm, where I'd wear my favorite red dress that he loved, annual anniversary trips, nothing extravagant, usually just weekend getaways to Michigan or Wisconsin, but they were our special time together. Every night before bed, no matter what, he'd kiss my forehead and say, Another day of loving you, Gloria. Richard was an attentive husband in many ways, but he was also intensely private about certain things. His office at home was his sanctuary, and I respected that space. He handled all our finances, which I was grateful for, since numbers were never my strong suit. He'd give me monthly updates about our accounts and investments, and everything always seemed to be in perfect order. I never had reason to question any of it. My parents died within 6 months of each other when I was 47. Dad from a stroke, Mom from what the doctors called natural causes, but what I knew was a broken heart. With no siblings and few extended family members, Richard became my entire world. We're a team, Glor, he'd say, using the nickname only he called me. No matter what, it's you and me against the world. I believed him with every fiber of my being. Our 30th anniversary celebration was just 9 months before Richard died. We renewed our vows in a private ceremony at the same chapel where we'd married, followed by a dinner cruise on Lake Michigan. Richard seemed emotional that night, holding me tighter than usual as we danced under the stars. "These 30 years have been the greatest gift," he whispered in my ear. "I want you to always remember how much you mean to me." At the time, I thought it was just anniversary sentimentality. Later, I'd wonder if he knew what was coming. For 31 years, I believed I was married to a faithful, honest man who shared my vision of a simple but meaningful life together. I trusted him completely. I never once checked his phone, questioned his whereabouts, or doubted his love for me. Our marriage wasn't perfect. We had disagreements and rough patches like any couple, but I never not once suspected that my entire reality was built on carefully constructed lies. I woke up on a Tuesday morning in February to the sound of silence. That was unusual because Richard always set his alarm for 5:30, even on days he didn't have early meetings. The soft beeping would gently pull me from sleep, followed by the familiar sounds of him starting the shower. That morning there was nothing. I rolled over to find him still lying there, unusually still. "Richard," I murmured, shaking his shoulder gently. When he didn't respond, I sat up and switched on the lamp. His face was peaceful, almost like he was sleeping, but something was terribly wrong. I shook him harder, called his name louder, but deep down, I already knew. The 911 operator told me to perform CPR. I tried sobbing as I pressed on his chest, but his body was already cool to the touch. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but they couldn't bring him back. Heart attack, they said. He had died peacefully in his sleep sometime during the night. At 58 years old, my husband was gone. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and arrangements. The funeral home, the obituary, the burial plot. I moved through it all like a ghost, numb and disbelieving. Susan, my best friend since college, took time off work to help me. She made sure I ate, screened my calls, and sat with me during the endless silent hours when grief would suddenly ambush me, leaving me gasping for air. There were oddities I didn't have the capacity to process at the time. Richard's colleagues from the firm were exceptionally helpful, almost too helpful, as if compensating for something. James, his closest work friend, kept asking about financial arrangements, wondering if Richard had explained everything to me. I assumed he meant standard widow concerns, insurance accounts, the mortgage. I started receiving strange phone calls, hang-ups, or people asking for Richard who seemed confused when I said he had passed. One woman asked specifically about Richard's plans for the weekend in Portland, and when I explained he had died, she gasped and hung up. I chalked it up to work colleagues who hadn't heard the news yet. The funeral home caused additional stress with their disorganization. The director kept referring to paperwork mix-ups and once asked me to clarify which Mrs. Hamilton was making the arrangements. When I stared at him in confusion, he quickly backpedaled, blaming their new computer system. In my grief-addled state, these peculiarities registered only as minor irritations in an already unbearable situation. Susan became my rock during those dark days. She'd known Richard almost as long as I had, having been in our wedding party and a constant presence in our lives. When I broke down sobbing while selecting photos for the memorial display, she held me and shared her own favorite memories of him. "He adored you, Gloria," she kept saying. "Never doubt that." While gathering Richard's personal effects for the funeral, I found things that didn't make sense. Receipts for jewelry I'd never received. Credit card statements with restaurant charges in Portland on weekends when he told me he was working late in Chicago. A key labeled Storage Unit B42 that I'd never seen before. But with the funeral just days away, I tucked these questions aside, telling myself there would be time for investigation after I'd laid my husband to rest. The night before the funeral, I sat alone in our bedroom, holding Richard's wedding ring. The funeral director had given it to me, along with his watch and the clothes they'd removed before preparing his body. I slipped the ring onto my thumb, where it sat loose but present, and I talked to him as if he were there. "I don't know how to be in the world without you," I told his photo on the nightstand. "We were supposed to grow old together." That night, I slept on his side of the bed, my face buried in his pillow that still held his scent. I had no idea that the next day wouldn't bring the closure I desperately needed. Instead, it would tear open a wound so deep I wasn't sure I'd survive it. The day of Richard's funeral dawned bright and clear, a beautiful winter day that seemed at odds with the darkness in my heart. I dressed carefully in a black suit he'd always complimented, applied minimal makeup, and fastened the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. The funeral service was scheduled for 11 at the non-denominational chapel near our home. Susan picked me up at 10, squeezing my hand as we drove in silence. When we arrived, I was surprised by how many people were already there. Richard had been well liked at his firm, and I expected colleagues, but there were faces I didn't recognize at all. As Susan escorted me to the front row, I noticed a well-dressed woman sitting on the opposite side of the aisle. She was perhaps my age, or a few years younger, with carefully styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking black dress. Beside her sat two young adults, a man and woman who appeared to be in their early 20s. Something about their appearance nagged at me. The young man's profile reminded me of someone, but in my emotional state, I couldn't place it. The service began with soft music, Frank Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight," our wedding song. The minister welcomed everyone and spoke generally about loss and remembrance before inviting Richard's colleague James to share memories. James spoke eloquently about Richard's professional accomplishments and integrity, making no mention of his personal life beyond saying he was devoted to his family. At the time, the phrasing didn't strike me as odd. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium on shaky legs. I had written notes, but found I didn't need them. I spoke from my heart about our 31 years together, about his gentle humor and unwavering support, about how he'd been my entire world since we met at that little diner so many years ago. As I spoke, I noticed the blonde woman's expression change dramatically. When I mentioned 31 years, her face went pale, and she gripped the pew in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned white. I finished my eulogy and returned to my seat, leaning heavily on Susan's arm. The minister asked if anyone else wished to share memories, and that's when everything exploded. The blonde woman stood up, her hands shaking visibly. "I need to speak," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel. She walked to the front, not to the podium, but to the center of the aisle where everyone could see her. "My name is Kathleen Hamilton," she announced, "and apparently I need to clarify something. Richard was my husband of 26 years. A collective gasp swept through the room. I felt Susan's arm tighten around me as the woman continued. "These are our children," Kathleen said, gesturing to the young adults beside her. "Thomas and Eliza. Richard and I have lived in Portland for the past 26 years, where he would return after his business trips to Chicago." The room began to spin around me as she turned to face me directly. "I don't know what kind of relationship you had with my husband," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "but I'm his wife. I have a marriage certificate, wedding photos, and 2 children to prove it. You're clearly the other woman he kept on the side." I stood on legs that threatened to buckle, my voice emerging as a strangled whisper. That's not possible. Richard and I were married 31 years ago. I have our marriage certificate too. Kathleen laughed bitterly. Then he committed fraud because we've been legally married since Thomas was on the way. Richard Hamilton has been my husband since 1997. The young man, Thomas, stood up, then his face a younger version of Richard's. Dad came home to us every 2 weeks like clockwork. He never missed a birthday or Christmas. He helped me with my college applications. He was at my graduation last year. Eliza joined him, tears streaming down her face. Why are you doing this? She demanded of me. Haven't we lost enough without you trying to what? Claim some portion of his life, his money. The chapel erupted in murmurs and shocked whispers. I looked around wildly, seeking any ally, any explanation, and saw several of Richard's colleagues averting their eyes. They knew. They'd all known. Richard Hamilton was my husband. I insisted, my voice growing stronger with anger. We've lived in Chicago our entire marriage. We have a home in Evanston. We have friends here, a life here. Kathleen stepped closer, her voice lower, but somehow more threatening. Richard Harris Hamilton lived with me in Portland. We have a home in the West Hills. Our children grew up there. I don't know who you think you were married to, but my husband used his middle name when he was here. He was Richard H. Hamilton in Chicago and Richard Harris in Portland. Apparently, he had quite a system worked out. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Richard had always gone by Richard H. Hamilton professionally. I'd never thought anything of it. The room tilted dangerously, and Susan stood up beside me. That's enough, she said firmly. This is neither the time nor place. Gloria has just lost her husband, same as you. Have some decency. But the damage was done. People were openly staring now, some with pity, others with what looked disturbingly like amusement at the scandal unfolding. Richard's business partner was on his phone in the back of the room, clearly calling for damage control. No one was thinking about honoring Richard anymore. This had become a spectacle. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. With one last look at the casket that held the man I thought I knew, I fled down the aisle and out into the bright, cold day. Susan caught up with me in the parking lot where I was gulping air between sobs. Get me out of here, I begged her. Please just get me out of here. As Susan drove me home, I curled into myself in the passenger seat, my mind racing through 31 years of memories, searching for signs I'd missed. The business trips, the separate office, the receipts I'd found, the storage unit key. It had all been there, but I'd been too trusting to see it. Did you know? I asked Susan when we reached my house. Did anyone know? Never. She swore, tears in her own eyes. Gloria, I would have told you. I would never have let you live a lie. I believed her, but it was little comfort. The man I'd loved for more than half my life, the man I just buried, was a complete stranger. And now I had to figure out who Richard Hamilton really was, and by extension, who that made me. The week after the funeral was the darkest of my life. I barely ate or slept, alternating between numbness and explosive bouts of anger and grief. Susan took a leave of absence from her job as a high school counselor to stay with me, sleeping in our guest room and making sure I didn't completely fall apart. We need to understand what happened, she told me on the third day, setting a cup of tea in front of me at the kitchen table. Not just for closure, but for practical reasons. There are going to be legal and financial implications, Gloria. She was right, though I could barely think beyond my immediate pain. Together, we started investigating the life of the man I thought I knew. Our first stop was the storage unit I'd found the key for. The facility was in a neighboring suburb, in a commercial district Richard had no business connections to, at least none I knew of. The unit was climate-controlled and about the size of a small bedroom. When we rolled up the door, I almost collapsed at what we found. Neatly organized shelves lined the walls filled with labeled boxes. Portland House documents, Kathleen tax returns, Thomas school records, Eliza College Fund, an entire wall dedicated to a family I never knew existed. Photos and frames showed Richard with Kathleen and their children at various ages, vacations, graduations, Christmases. Their wedding photo showed a beaming Richard in a tuxedo next to Kathleen, in a lace gown, her stomach slightly rounded with what must have been their son. "He kept everything," Susan whispered, holding my arm to steady me. "He documented his entire second life." There were financial records showing mortgage payments on a house in Portland's West Hills, credit card statements with charges for family dinners, Eliza's dance lessons, Thomas's football equipment, a family calendar showing Richard's schedule, when he'd be in Portland versus Chicago. It was all meticulously organized and maintained. Most disturbing was a box labeled Schedule and System. Inside were journals where Richard had documented his elaborate double life, how he used his middle name and a slight variation of his last name in Portland, how he'd structured his business travel to allow him to live as two different people, how he'd set up separate phone lines, email accounts, and credit cards. He'd even noted which colleagues knew about the arrangement and had helped cover for him. "I can't believe James knew," I said, finding his name on Richard's list of confidants. "He's been to our home for dinner dozens of times. He brought us an anniversary gift last year." We spent hours in that storage unit piecing together the extent of Richard's deception. It appeared that 5 years into our marriage, while on a legitimate business trip to Portland, Richard had met Kathleen. Instead of ending things with either of us, he'd created an entire system that allowed him to maintain both relationships. He became Richard Harris in Portland, keeping his middle initial H when in Chicago to minimize confusion with documentation. The next day, we confronted James at a coffee shop near his office. His face fell when he saw me approaching his table, and I knew instantly that every suspicion was correct. "How long did you know?" I asked without preamble, sliding into the chair across from him. James couldn't meet my eyes. "Since Thomas was born," he admitted. "About 24 years. Richard needed someone to help cover for him when schedules conflicted. It started with just small things, taking a call, making an excuse. Then it became more involved." "And you never thought to tell me that my entire marriage was a lie?" My voice was deadly calm, though I was shaking inside. "It wasn't my place," he said weakly. "Richard was my best friend, and he did love you, Gloria. That wasn't a lie." "Get out of my sight," I told him, my voice breaking. "I never want to see you again." Back at home, Susan and I continued piecing together Richard's double life. Birth certificates showed Thomas was 24 and Eliza 22, confirming Richard had started his relationship with Kathleen just 5 years into our marriage. The revelation made me physically ill. During the same period when we were going through fertility treatments, desperately trying to have a child together, he was starting another family with someone else. "I don't understand how he managed this financially," Susan said as we reviewed bank statements. 2 households, 2 families, college tuitions. The documentation revealed Richard's intricate financial arrangements. He had maintained entirely separate accounts for each family, carefully allocating his income and investments to support both households. His position at the firm gave him significant control over his finances, allowing him to compartmentalize his resources without raising red flags. Just as we were trying to make sense of the financial aspects, I received a call from a Michael Jenkins who introduced himself as Richard's attorney. "Mrs. Hamilton, I'm handling Richard's estate," he explained. "We need to schedule the reading of the will. There are complications that need to be addressed promptly." "You mean the fact that my husband had another wife and family?" I asked bitterly. There was a pause before Jenkins responded. "Yes, that would be the complication. I've also been contacted by an attorney representing Kathleen Hamilton. She's making claims against the estate." My heart sank. Beyond the emotional devastation, was I about to lose my financial security as well? Our home. Everything we'd built over 31 years. "When do we need to do this?" I asked. "As soon as possible," Jenkins replied. "Tomorrow at 3 at my office downtown." I agreed and hung up, turning to Susan with panic rising in my chest. Kathleen has an attorney. She's going to try to take everything. Susan squeezed my hand. We'll fight this, Gloria. You were his wife, his first wife. You have rights. But as I looked around the home I'd shared with Richard, I wondered if I had any real claim to any of it. Our entire marriage had been built on lies. Did I even know the man whose last name I carried? The tension in attorney Michael Jenkins's downtown office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Susan and I arrived exactly at 3, only to find Kathleen, Thomas, and Eliza already seated in the conference room. Thomas glared at me with naked hostility, while Eliza studied me with uncomfortable intensity. Kathleen sat rigidly in her chair, a well-dressed man I assumed was her attorney at her side. "Miss Morgan," Kathleen said coldly, deliberately, using my maiden name. "How generous of you to join us." I straightened my spine, refusing to be intimidated. "It's Mrs. Hamilton," I corrected her, "and I have as much right to be here as you." Before the situation could escalate, Jenkins entered with a leather portfolio and a somber expression. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted everyone with professional courtesy, though I could sense his discomfort. "Thank you all for coming," he began after introductions. "This is certainly an unusual situation, and I appreciate everyone's cooperation as we work through it." Kathleen's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Lawrence Daniels, leaned forward. "My client is Richard Hamilton's legal wife and the mother of his children. She has clear rights to the entirety of his estate." Jenkins held up a hand. "Before we address any claims, I need to explain something important. Richard prepared for this eventuality. He left specific instructions and a rather unconventional will." He opened his portfolio and removed a slim device. "Richard recorded a video will. He felt it was the only way to properly address everyone involved." My heart hammered in my chest as Jenkins set up a small projector. The image of Richard appeared on the wall, healthy, alive, sitting in what appeared to be his office at work. The sight of him made me physically recoil. He was wearing the blue shirt I'd given him for his last birthday. "If you're watching this," Richard began, his voice steady but solemn, "then I'm gone and the truth has come out. First, I want to say I'm sorry. To Gloria, to Kathleen, to Thomas, and Eliza. What I've done is unforgivable, and I know that. I never intended for things to happen this way." He took a deep breath before continuing. 31 years ago, I married Gloria Morgan, the love of my young life. We built a beautiful life together in Chicago. 5 years later, while on a business trip to Portland, I met Kathleen Davis. What began as a brief indiscretion during a rough patch in my first marriage became something more. When Kathleen told me she was pregnant with Thomas, I made the worst decision of my life. I created a second identity and married her as well. In the conference room, Kathleen made a small pained sound. I couldn't look at her. "What started as one lie became thousands," Richard continued on screen. "I convinced myself I was protecting everyone from pain, but the truth is, I was a coward. I couldn't bear to lose either of my families, so I constructed an elaborate deception that allowed me to keep both. Some colleagues knew and helped maintain my secret, for which I'm also deeply sorry." Richard's expression became more businesslike. "Now to practical matters. I've structured my estate to provide for everyone as fairly as possible under these impossible circumstances. To Gloria, I leave our Chicago home and half of my savings and investment portfolio. To Kathleen, I leave our Portland home and the other half of my savings and investment portfolio. To Thomas and Eliza, I leave my personal possessions to be divided as they choose, as well as the education funds already established in their names." Kathleen's attorney immediately objected. "This is outrageous. My client cannot be expected to accept only half of what's rightfully hers." Jenkins paused the video. "Mr. Daniels, there's more information you should hear before making legal claims." The video resumed with Richard looking directly at the camera. "I understand this arrangement may be challenged, so I should clarify. A legal reality, my marriage to Gloria was registered under my legal name, Richard Henry Hamilton. My marriage to Kathleen was registered under Richard Harris, using my middle name as my surname. While both marriages were conducted in good faith by my wives, technically speaking, the marriage to Gloria was the only legally binding one, as it was under my true legal identity. Kathleen gasped audibly. "That's not possible," she whispered, turning to her attorney. "We have a marriage license." "Under the name Richard Harris," Jenkins confirmed gently. "I've reviewed all the documentation. While you certainly believed you were legally married, Mr. Hamilton created a legal fiction. From a strictly legal standpoint, Miss Morgan Hamilton was his only legal wife." Kathleen's face crumpled, and for the first time I felt a flash of sympathy for her. She'd been deceived just as thoroughly as I had. Richard continued speaking. "There's one additional matter. For Gloria only, I've left a sealed letter with Michael. It's private, and I ask that she be given the space to read it alone when she's ready." Jenkins handed me a thick envelope with my name written in Richard's familiar handwriting. I clutched it tightly, uncertain whether I wanted to know what it contained. "This is not over," Kathleen declared, standing abruptly. Her cool composure had cracked, revealing raw pain beneath. "I spent 26 years with that man. I raised his children. I will not be dismissed with half of what's mine." Her attorney placed a calming hand on her arm. "We'll review our options," he said to Jenkins. "You'll be hearing from us." As they gathered their belongings to leave, Eliza suddenly turned to me. "Did you know about us?" she asked, her voice small and vulnerable, despite her hostile stance. "No," I answered truthfully. "I had no idea Richard had another family until the funeral. I'm as shocked as you are." Something in my face must have convinced her, because she nodded slightly before following her mother and brother out. When they were gone, I turned to Jenkins. "Is what he said true about the legality?" Jenkins nodded gravely. "Yes. Richard was very careful about maintaining the separation of his two identities. Kathleen can contest the will, but she's unlikely to succeed. Your marriage has legal primacy." It was a hollow victory. Legal primacy meant nothing when my entire marriage had been a charade. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, wondering what final words Richard had for me alone. "Take it home," Susan suggested gently. "Read it when you're ready." I nodded, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. We thanked Jenkins and left the sealed letter burning a hole in my handbag, containing what I feared would be one final betrayal from the man who had already taken so much from me. Back in the silent emptiness of the house I'd shared with Richard, I placed the sealed envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for hours. Susan made dinner that I couldn't eat, then gently suggested I try to rest. "I'll be in the guest room if you need me," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "Take your time with that letter. There's no rush." But once I was alone, the envelope seemed to pulse with a life of its own, demanding my attention. Just after midnight, I finally gathered my courage, made a cup of tea, and sat down to read Richard's final words to me. Inside the main envelope was another sealed envelope and a handwritten letter on Richard's personal stationery. With trembling hands, I unfolded the pages. "My dearest Gloria," it began. "By the time you read this, you will know the truth about the life I've been leading. There's no excuse for what I've done, and I won't insult you by trying to provide one. Instead, I want to give you the complete truth, something I should have done years ago." Richard explained that he'd met Kathleen during a particularly difficult time in our marriage, when our third round of fertility treatments had failed, and we were both emotionally exhausted and disconnected. What began as a brief affair became complicated when Kathleen became pregnant. "I made the first of many terrible decisions then," he wrote. "I couldn't bear to hurt you by confessing, especially when you were already devastated about our inability to have children, and I couldn't abandon Kathleen and my unborn child, so I created a solution that was no solution at all. I began living two separate lives." He detailed how he'd constructed his elaborate double life, using his position at the firm to create travel schedules that allowed him to spend time in both Chicago and Portland. He'd opened separate accounts, created separate credit cards, and maintained separate circles of friends, with only a few trusted colleagues knowing the truth. Each lie required another lie to support it, he continued, until I was trapped in a web of my own making. The strangest part is that I truly loved both you and Kathleen, though in different ways. With you, Gloria, I shared history, comfort, and the deepest parts of myself. You were my first love, my true partner. What I felt for Kathleen began as something else entirely, but grew into its own kind of love, complicated by our children and the guilt I carried. The most shocking revelation came halfway through the letter. A year ago, I was diagnosed with a heart condition. The doctors told me I likely had less than 2 years to live. I decided then that I couldn't die with this secret intact, allowing the chaos to descend upon both families without preparation. I began putting my affairs in order, planning how to finally end the deception. I gasped, tears blurring my vision. He'd known he was dying and hadn't told me. He'd robbed me of the chance to prepare to cherish our final moments together, just as he'd robbed me of so much else. What Jenkins doesn't know, Richard's letter continued, is that I created a third account several years ago. This account contains my business investments, partnerships, and life insurance policies. It represents the largest portion of my estate, substantially more than what I've left to either you or Kathleen in the will. My hands shook as I read on. This account and all assets connected to it, I leave solely to you, Gloria. The login information for the account is in the enclosed envelope. I've done this for 2 reasons. First, because despite everything, you were my first and truest love. Second, because Kathleen had the gift of our children, something you wanted desperately, but never experienced because of my deception. I opened the second envelope with unsteady fingers, finding account information for an investment portfolio and insurance policies totaling over $5 million, far more than the assets mentioned in the official will. The final paragraphs of Richard's letter stunned me further. 3 months before my death, I had begun the process of coming clean. I'd consulted with a different attorney about divorcing both you and Kathleen legally, and then being honest with everyone about what I'd done. I drafted emails to both of you explaining everything, which you'll find in the email account listed with the financial information. I planned to send them and face the consequences of my actions. But my heart had other plans, it seems. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, dawn beginning to lighten the sky outside, as I processed this final twist. Richard had planned to end both marriages, to finally tell the truth. Had death not taken him, first, our marriage would have ended anyway, not with this public humiliation, but with a private confession that would have been devastating in a different way. The letter concluded, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, Gloria. What I've done is unforgivable. I only hope that this final gift gives you the freedom to build a new life on your own terms, one not shadowed by lies. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. You deserved honesty, faithfulness, and a family of your own. I failed you in the worst possible ways. Be angry with me. Hate me if you must. But please, when you're ready, find happiness again. You are the best person I've ever known, and the fact that I couldn't be worthy of you is my greatest regret. With love, despite everything, Richard. I sat in the kitchen until Susan found me there at sunrise. The letter spread before me. Tears dried on my face. As the early light filtered through the windows, I wasn't sure what I felt. Anger, grief, vindication, or some complex mixture of all 3. But I did know one thing: Richard's final deception, the secret account, had given me something unexpected, the power to decide what happened next. 6 months after Richard's funeral, I stood at the window of my new lakefront cottage, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of pink and gold. So much had changed in those months. My home, my understanding of my past, and most importantly, my vision for my future. Kathleen had contested the will as expected. Her attorney argued that she had entered the marriage in good faith and deserved equal consideration under common law principles. The case dragged through preliminary hearings for 3 months before the judge ruled decisively in my favor, citing the legal primacy of my marriage and the clear language of Richard's will. Kathleen received exactly what Richard had specified: the Portland house and half of the disclosed assets. What no one knew, except for Susan and my new financial advisor, was that I had access to the much larger fortune Richard had set aside. I never mentioned this to Kathleen or her children, feeling that Richard's wishes in this matter at least should be respected. About 2 months after the funeral, I received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Hamilton. "Ms. Morgan," he said formally, "my sister and I would like to meet with you. There are things we feel we need to understand." I agreed with trepidation, suggesting a neutral coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, both Thomas and Eliza were already there, looking uncomfortable but determined. Thomas had Richard's eyes and build, while Eliza had his smile. Seeing those familiar features in these strangers was disconcerting. "Thank you for coming," Thomas began awkwardly after we'd ordered coffee. "This is weird for all of us, but we need to know more about our father's other life. About you." I could have been defensive or bitter, but something in their expressions, a mixture of grief, confusion, and genuine curiosity, softened my response. "What would you like to know?" For the next 2 hours, we engaged in a surprisingly civil conversation. They asked about how I'd met Richard, what our life had been like, what kind of husband he'd been to me. In turn, I asked about their childhood, their memories of Richard as a father. We discovered strange parallels: how Richard had a ritual of making pancakes on Sunday mornings in both households, how he always sang off-key in the car, how he remembered every birthday with thoughtfully chosen gifts. "He was two different people," Eliza said wonderingly, "but somehow the same person too." "He took me fishing every summer at the same lake in Oregon," Thomas shared. "Said it was his favorite place in the world." I nodded, feeling a strange twist in my heart. He told me the same thing about a lake in Wisconsin where we vacationed. As we talked, something unexpected happened. Rather than increasing my anger, sharing these stories with Richard's children gave me a strange sense of connection and even comfort. They had loved and been loved by the same man, however flawed he was. They were also victims of his deception, just as I was. Before we parted, Eliza asked hesitantly, would it be okay if we stayed in touch? Not all the time, but maybe occasionally. I was surprised to find myself agreeing. I think I'd like that. The meeting with Thomas and Eliza catalyzed something in me. After months of anger and grief, I was ready to make decisions about my future. The first involved Richard's secret fortune. After extensive reflection and consultation with financial and legal advisors, I decided to use the bulk of the money to establish the New Beginnings Foundation, dedicated to supporting fertility treatments for couples who couldn't afford them. It felt like the right way to transform Richard's betrayal into something positive, helping others achieve the family we had been denied. I kept enough to ensure my financial security, but directed most of the funds to the foundation. My next decision was to sell our Evanston house. Every corner held memories that now felt tainted. I found a small but beautiful cottage on the shores of Lake Michigan, about an hour north of the city, a place with no history where I could start fresh. The cottage needed renovation, which gave me a project to focus my energy on. Susan remained my steadfast support through all these changes. "You're rebuilding your life on your terms," she told me, as we painted my new living room a cheerful yellow. "I'm so proud of you, Gloria." I decided to take early retirement from teaching, using some of my newfound financial freedom to travel, something Richard had never been particularly interested in. My first solo trip was to Paris, a city I'd always longed to visit, but Richard had always deferred with vague promises of someday. Standing alone at the top of the Eiffel Tower, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and exhilaration, grief for what I'd lost balanced by excitement for what lay ahead. At 58, I even dipped my toe into dating again. A neighbor at the lake introduced me to her brother, a kind widower named Daniel, who took me sailing and made me laugh for the first time in months. Nothing serious developed, but it was a reminder that my life wasn't over, that connection was still possible. Perhaps the most surprising development came when Kathleen contacted me directly asking to meet. We chose a restaurant halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee, where she was visiting her sister. She looked different from the angry, devastated woman at the funeral and the will reading, still elegant, but somehow softer, more human. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said after we'd ordered, getting straight to the point. "She suggested it might be healing for me to talk with you, not to fight or blame, but to understand." Over lunch, we shared our experiences of loving and losing the same man. Kathleen revealed that she'd had her own doubts over the years, finding receipts she couldn't explain, noticing how Richard never wanted their children to travel to Chicago with him. "I chose not to see what was right in front of me," she admitted. "I loved our life, our family. I didn't want to risk losing it by asking too many questions." "I did the same thing," I acknowledged. "We both trusted someone who didn't deserve that trust." By the end of our lunch, we'd forged a strange bond. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect born of shared experience. We agreed to keep each other updated on the children and to approach the future with a commitment to honesty that had been absent from our past. As my first year of widowhood came to a close, the New Beginnings Foundation funded its first successful fertility treatment, resulting in a pregnancy for a young couple from Detroit. When I received the news, I sat on my porch overlooking the lake and wept, not from sadness this time, but from a sense of purpose fulfilled. The foundation became my passion, giving meaning to the pain I'd endured. Each family we helped heal a small piece of my own wounded heart. I began speaking at fundraising events, sharing a carefully edited version of my story to inspire donations. What had been my greatest shame gradually transformed into a source of strength and purpose. The lesson I learned through all of this wasn't what I expected. It wasn't about the dangers of trust or the fragility of love. It was about identity and resilience. For 31 years, I defined myself primarily as Richard's wife. When that identity was shattered, I had to discover who Gloria really was, not as an extension of someone else, but as a complete person in her own right. Richard's betrayal had broken my heart, but it had also ironically set me free. Free to define myself on my own terms. Free to build a life centered on my own values and desires, rather than compromises made to accommodate someone else's deception. Free to experience emotions honestly, without the shadow of lies. As I watched the last rays of sun disappear beneath the horizon, I felt at peace for the first time since Richard's death. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. I suspected it never would, but it had transformed into something I could carry without being crushed by its weight. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led to unexpected freedom? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Like and subscribe if this journey resonated with you, and share with anyone who might need to be reminded that sometimes losing everything you thought you had makes room for everything you actually need. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, our truest strength often emerges from our deepest wounds.